What do you do when church hurts you? Welcome to You Can't Say That in Church, a video podcast where we talk about all of the awkward topics. My name is Chandrese and I'm your host, and each episode we take some time to focus on a topic that is often avoided in the church. Today's words that shall not be said are church hurts. Now, something that I've often found is that when people attend a church, they have an expectation. They kind of think of it like a business. They go to the church for their product of happiness, they get refreshed, they get refilled for the week, they leave, they come back for more happiness the following week. However, this expectation is not really found in the Bible. And so when we think of the church this way, we oftentimes are setting ourselves up to be very disappointed. Now, don't get me wrong, because I do believe that church should, in general, be a happy space. However, whenever you're dealing with a group of people for an extended period of time, no matter where that group of people is, you're going to find that sometimes you get into disagreements. Sometimes your feelings get hurt. So the question really becomes, what do you do when those moments happen? Because it can be very easy to feel like, okay, this business is not giving me the product I expect to receive. This happiness is dysfunctional. I'm going to go ahead and complain to God, and then I'm going to find me another business that's going to give me the product that I'm looking for. Like, what if church had a Yelp? Sorry. But anyway, I believe that it is frequently the case that our expectations of the church are what set us up for disappointment. And so today we're going to explore what church really looks like from a biblical standpoint and see how we can shift our expectations to match that. Now, I don't know if you guys really read the Bible. Hopefully you do if you're watching this podcast, or hopefully this podcast is encouraging you to look into the Bible a little bit more. But if you ever read the New Testament and you look at the early church, you will notice that it is highly dysfunctional. And that's what we're going to really explore. We're going to talk about the Bible today. I hope that you can stick with me. That's what this podcast is all about. And we're going to look at a relationship in the Bible that I think will help us to illustrate this concept of church hurt. We're going to be talking about Paul and Barnabas. This story is very full of tea, so I'm going to try and tell it to you in a way that keeps your engagement. So Paul, he was a major persecutor of Christians. And so, as you might imagine, when he started teaching the gospel, he didn't have the best reputation amongst people because he had previously been persecuting them. And so they weren't really inclined to listen to him. But Barnabas, on the other hand, had a great reputation with the church. And so he vouched for Paul. He stood up for Paul and said, hey, you should listen to this guy. And because people trusted Barnabas, they then accepted Paul. Paul and Barnabas were like a tag team. They were like partners for Christ. And they would travel all around the world, starting churches and preaching the gospel to people who would not have necessarily received it. A lot of times they were preaching to Gentiles, and they would start these churches and check up on them, and they would travel together for years. On one of their trips, often referred to as the first missionary trip, they brought along Mark. Mark was Barnabas's cousin, and he went along with them for the first leg of the trip. But then like halfway through, he was like, all right, y'all, I'm out. I'm going to go back to Jerusalem. And he kind of abandoned the trip, and Paul and Barnabas continued on. So the next trip came along, second trip, and Barnabas was like, all right, cool, Mark, you ready to go? But then Paul said, hey, I don't want Mark to come, because last time we went on a trip, Mark just kind of quit halfway through, and I'm not down with that. But Barnabas, who was always known as the encourager, his name actually means the encourager. His real name is Joseph, but whatever, that's a whole nother story. But Barnabas, the encourager, was like, you know what? Like, he's my cousin. And I want him to come. And we need to be able to give people second chances. I'm sure everything will be fine this time. And yeah, let's go ahead and do it. And this became what the Bible refers to as a strong disagreement between Paul and Barnabas. Paul decided to go his own way with Silas, and Barnabas decided to go his own way with Mark. And from what we can tell, Paul and Barnabas never saw each other again. At least there's no record of it. Now, what I find very ironic about this story is that Barnabas was doing the same thing for Mark that he did for Paul, because Paul was definitely somebody who needed a second chance, somebody to vouch for him, somebody to push to allow him to be accepted. And so Barnabas was being very true to who he always was, but Paul, who is very strict, I don't know. I don't know the whole story. I wasn't there. But Paul definitely didn't accept Mark back. And so I kind of side with Barnabas on this story, but in the Bible, people tend to side with Paul. Now, it's helpful when we're looking at the story of Paul and Barnabas to consider the structure of the early church. The early church was all one church, but it had many locations. The location in Jerusalem was like the main location, but then there were other church plants all over that had church leaders. Paul and Barnabas were the leaders of the church of Antioch. Now, I explain all of this because I want to make it clear that these two were still attending the same church. Yes, they may have been traveling to different locations, different areas at different times, but they would have been both communicating with the church in Jerusalem, still had the same group of friends. They would have had to check up on the churches that they started together to make sure those churches were still flourishing. They were both very much still involved in ministry. They both very much still had the same mission that they were doing together, but now they had to do it apart. I'm actually a sucker for a sappy ending. Like when I read this story, I want to see that Paul and Barnabas reconciled and they had a beautiful ministry that flourished after they got over their issues, but that's really not what happened. That wasn't the reality. The reality was they probably never saw each other again, or if they did, they never talked about it again. So they never got back to the position that they were in when they first started. And that definitely makes me sad, but it's also encouraging because sometimes this is a reality in our own lives. Sometimes we have relationships that don't get restored. And I pray for restoration in all of your relationships that you desire restoration in. But sometimes that's not our reality. And we have to find a way to exist in the church and pursue our missions, even when that's the case. One of the most poignant lessons that we can take from this story of Paul and Barnabas is that although your relationships may change, your mission can stay the same. And also make sure you go to a church with multiple locations. But we want to hear from you, so you can go ahead and drop your opinion in the comments. You can subscribe to this channel to be a part of the conversation going forward. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode. Stay chewy.